It's 8 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in Croydon, London. A young girl, bright with the promise of a future she dreamed of, steps off the bus to head to school. But this day is different. In a flash, everything changes. She never makes it home. Elianne Andam, only 15 years old, is dead, stabbed in cold blood in broad daylight. Who could have done this? Why was she targeted? And what secrets will the investigation reveal? Elianne Andam was like many teenagers in Croydon, full of promise, ambition, and hope. At just 15, she was already known for her intelligence and her warm, kind nature. She had a dream: to become a human rights lawyer, to fight for those who couldn't defend themselves. Elianne was involved in school clubs, volunteered in her local community, and was well liked by her teachers and peers. She had a bright future ahead of her. But in an instant, that future was stolen. It was September 2024 when Elianne's life was tragically cut short. On a typical Tuesday morning, she left her family's home for the short walk to the bus stop that would take her to school. It was a morning like any other, quiet, peaceful, and full of normal routine. Her mother, Nadine, kissed her goodbye, as she always did, and sent her on her way. But this morning would be different. At approximately 8:20 a.m., Elianne was attacked just outside a bus stop near her school. A witness reported seeing a figure approach her from behind and deliver a fatal blow. The attack was swift, brutal, and seemingly random. The stab wounds were deep, and by the time help arrived, it was too late. Elianne was dead. The police arrived at the scene quickly, cordoning off the area and beginning their search for clues. The shock of the crime sent waves through the Croydon community. A young girl, so full of promise, murdered in broad daylight. People who knew Elianne couldn't understand how this could happen. No one saw it coming. Who would want to hurt her? Was it random? Or did someone target her specifically? The investigation into Elianne's murder began immediately, with the police interviewing witnesses, friends, and family. However, the trail quickly grew cold. No one could provide any clear answers. There was no sign of a struggle, no one saw the attacker, and no one knew why Elianne was chosen. The investigation continued, but the police faced a daunting challenge. They were no closer to finding out who had committed such a senseless crime, and the mystery surrounding her murder only deepened. No one knew who would have wanted to harm such a young, promising girl. Was it a random act of violence, or was it something more sinister? As the weeks went by, Elianne's mother, Nadine, made public appeals, begging for anyone with information to come forward. But the answers never came. The community began to wonder, would this case ever be solved? Months passed, and the case seemed to fade from the headlines. But for Nadine and Elianne's family, the pain never stopped. Every day, without answers, was another day of heartbreak. And then, just as the case seemed to go cold, something unexpected happened. A new lead came through. The case of Elianne Andam's tragic murder had shaken the small community of Croydon to its core. For days, the streets were quiet, residents walking around in stunned disbelief. The image of a young girl stabbed to death in broad daylight haunted the city, and questions lingered in the air. Who did this, and why? The police were under immense pressure to solve the case. The attack had been quick, violent, and seemingly random. The authorities had no suspect and no clear motive. The community was in shock, and Elianne's mother, Nadine, was utterly devastated. She spent her days at the police station hoping for answers, but each day, without any new leads, felt like a day further from closure. In the meantime, the police intensified their investigation. Detectives began to canvass the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking questions. They reviewed CCTV footage from local shops and businesses, hoping to find any clue that might lead them to the killer. But despite their best efforts, the footage provided no clear leads. It seemed as though the murderer had vanished into thin air after committing the crime. Word began to spread about a potential suspect, someone who had been seen in the area around the time of the murder. A local man, Paul Harris, had been walking near the bus stop when the attack occurred. He was described by a witness as being agitated, looking over his shoulder as though he was being pursued. Detectives quickly moved in to question Paul Harris. He was a 28-year-old mechanic, someone who was known to the community but not well liked. He had a reputation for being hot-headed and had recently been in a public argument with a group of teenagers at a nearby pub. When the police arrived at his home, they found him acting nervously. He didn't have an alibi for the time of Elianne's murder, and his behavior seemed increasingly suspicious. But when the police searched his home, they found nothing linking him to the crime. There were no weapons, no bloodstains, and no signs of foul play. Paul Harris denied any involvement, and despite the police's mounting suspicions, they were unable to charge him with any crime. Meanwhile, Nadine, Elianne's mother, was beginning to lose hope. Her daughter's death had devastated her, and every day without answers was another layer of grief she could not bear. The pain of losing her child weighed heavily on her, but she was determined not to let Elianne's death go unnoticed. In the weeks following the murder, Nadine appeared on local television, pleading for help. "I just want to know who did this to my daughter. She was a good girl, a kind girl. Why would anyone hurt her?" she cried. "Please, if you know anything, come forward. My daughter deserves justice." Her emotional plea resonated with the public. For the first time since Elianne's death, there was a renewed sense of urgency. Local newspapers picked up the story, and more people came forward with information. One witness described seeing a car speeding away from the bus stop just minutes after the attack. Another witness claimed to have seen someone matching Paul Harris's description near a nearby alley shortly before the murder took place. The police began to re-examine the evidence, wondering if they had missed something earlier. Could Paul Harris have been lying? A breakthrough came when the police discovered something disturbing. Hidden in the alleyway near the bus stop, the authorities found a discarded knife. It was a simple blade, nothing fancy, but it was covered in blood. DNA tests confirmed that the blood on the knife belonged to Elianne. The discovery of the knife reignited the investigation. The police quickly traced the knife back to a pawn shop, where it had been sold 2 weeks earlier. The pawn shop owner recalled that the knife had been sold by a man named Paul Harris. This was the key the police had been waiting for. Now they had a direct link between Paul Harris and the murder weapon. The question remained, why had he killed Elianne? Paul Harris was arrested and brought in for questioning. During the interrogation, he was calm, almost too calm. He denied killing Elianne, but his story was inconsistent. He claimed that he had sold the knife because it had been sitting in his drawer for years. But when pressed, his story fell apart. He started to get defensive, refusing to answer questions directly. The police also learned more about Paul's history. He had a violent past, multiple charges of assault, some of which had been dropped, but the pattern of violence was there. He had always been known for his short temper, and many suspected that he had been involved in other incidents that were never fully investigated. As the interrogation continued, Paul's demeanor began to change. He started to show signs of nervousness, tapping his foot repeatedly and avoiding eye contact. Eventually, after hours of questioning, Paul Harris finally broke down and confessed to the crime. "I didn't mean to hurt her," Paul muttered, tears streaming down his face. "I was just so angry. She didn't deserve it, but I couldn't stop myself." It turned out that Paul Harris had known Elianne. They had crossed paths a few times in the past, but their interaction had been brief. Paul, it seemed, had developed an unhealthy obsession with her. He'd been watching her for weeks, and one morning, his rage got the better of him. The attack, Paul claimed, had been a spontaneous act of violence. "I didn't even plan it," Paul said, his voice trembling. "It just happened. I didn't know what I was doing, but I knew I had to stop her from telling anyone." But why? What had Eli known that made Paul go to such extremes? The confession from Paul Harris was the breakthrough the police had desperately needed. They had finally found their killer, and yet questions still lingered in the air. Why had Paul Harris, a man with a history of violence, chosen Elianne as his victim? And more troublingly, was there someone else involved in this murder? Could Paul's story about a spontaneous act of violence be true, or was there something more sinister at play? As the police dug deeper into Paul's past, the answers they uncovered shocked everyone. It was revealed that Paul had been obsessed with Elianne for several months. He had been watching her from afar, a fact that had gone unnoticed by her family and friends. There was no clear evidence of any previous interaction between Paul and Elianne, but the more the authorities uncovered, the more troubling the picture became. Elianne had never mentioned Paul Harris to anyone, and there were no signs that she had ever felt threatened by him. But the obsession wasn't just one-sided. Elianne had, unknowingly, become a part of Paul's twisted fantasy. He had kept tabs on her social media accounts, learning about her likes, dislikes, and her passion for human rights. To him, she wasn't just a girl from the neighborhood. She was an ideal, someone he could never have but couldn't stop thinking about. His fixation on her had grown with each passing day until it reached a boiling point. Elianne's mother, Nadine, struggled to comprehend this. She had thought that her daughter was just another teenager, living her life, going to school, and making plans for the future. She had no idea that Elianne's life had been under surveillance, not by a stranger, but by a man she had never met. Detectives continued to pore over every detail of Paul Harris's life. They uncovered a troubling pattern. He had been arrested before, but his cases had been dropped, either due to lack of evidence or because his victims were too afraid to come forward. He had a violent temper and had been in and out of trouble for years. Yet, he had managed to evade serious consequences each time. The police had always brushed him off as a minor nuisance, until now. As the investigation unfolded, the police were able to track down more information about Paul's actions on the day of the murder. They found surveillance footage from a nearby store that showed Paul walking past the bus stop, glancing at Elianne as she stood waiting. His eyes darted nervously, but he didn't seem to be in a rush. It was as if he was waiting for something, or perhaps for someone. The most chilling discovery, however, came when the police reviewed more CCTV footage from the area. One camera, hidden in a nearby alley, showed Paul lingering near Elianne's path just moments before the attack. There was no sign of the knife, but the footage confirmed that Paul had been watching her for some time. He didn't approach her until she was alone, and even then, he hesitated before finally making his move. The police now had the full picture of that fateful morning. Paul had been stalking Elianne for weeks, waiting for the right moment to strike. And when it came, it was over in an instant. The attack was brutal and swift, leaving no chance for Elianne to fight back. Paul's confession had seemed almost too convenient at first, but with the evidence mounting, the authorities were now certain that he was responsible for Elianne's death. The tragic loss of a young life had been driven by nothing more than Paul's obsessive fantasies and his uncontrollable rage. Despite the clarity of the case, the questions did not end there. Elianne's family still couldn't understand why she had been targeted. Nadine, who had lost her daughter in such a senseless way, struggled to find peace with the fact that Elianne had been the victim of such a violent obsession. For her, the pain was not just the loss of a child, but the realization that her daughter's dreams had been shattered by a man who had never truly known her. The community in Croydon was equally devastated. This was not a random act of violence, but the result of a twisted obsession that had gone unnoticed until it was too late. The case left everyone questioning how someone could be so close, yet so far away, and how the signs of a predator could have been missed by everyone. The court date loomed closer, and the town of Croydon braced itself for what would come next. Paul Harris would stand trial for the murder of Elianne Andam, but many believed that the trial would only uncover the surface of something far darker. What had driven Paul to this point? Was he a lone wolf acting on his own, or had there been someone else involved? As the trial date approached, the small town of Croydon was bracing for what was sure to be a dramatic and emotional court proceeding. The tragic murder of Elianne Andam had captured the attention of the public, and now the man responsible was about to face justice. The courtroom, like the rest of the community, was filled with tension as Paul Harris stood trial for the brutal murder of the 15-year-old girl. The case against Paul seemed open and shut. His confession, combined with the damning CCTV footage and the bloodstained knife found in the alley, made his guilt almost certain. But as the trial unfolded, it became clear that there were still more questions to be answered, questions that no one had expected. The prosecution was firm in its case, presenting evidence of Paul's obsession with Elianne. They described how Paul had stalked her for weeks, learning every detail of her life, until the moment when he snapped. They detailed how he had hidden in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. His confession, although chilling, was backed up by hard evidence. Elianne had been his target, and Paul had planned her murder for weeks, even if he hadn't fully understood why. But the defense was equally determined to challenge the narrative. They argued that Paul Harris had not intended to kill Elianne. He had confessed, yes, but they suggested that his actions had been driven by an overwhelming, uncontrollable rage, an outburst that was out of his hands. His lawyer painted him as a man with deep mental health struggles, someone who had been dealing with his own demons for years. The defense even brought up Paul's difficult childhood, the abuse he had suffered, and his troubled past with violence. To many in the courtroom, this defense felt like an attempt to humanize a killer, to shift the blame away from Paul's actions and onto circumstances beyond his control. But it didn't sway the public's opinion, especially not Elianne's family, who were present every day of the trial. Nadine, Elianne's mother, sat in the front row, staring at the man who had taken her daughter's life. Her face was a mask of sorrow and anger. She didn't want to hear about Paul's troubled past. She wanted justice for her daughter. "I don't care what happened to him when he was a child," Nadine said quietly to the reporters gathered outside the courtroom. "He killed my daughter, and that's what I care about." As the trial progressed, the courtroom saw the tension rise. Victims' family members, friends, and community leaders all made statements about how Elianne's death had impacted them. For many, the pain was still fresh, and the questions about why this had happened were still raw. Despite the defense's attempt to lessen Paul's responsibility, the weight of the evidence against him was undeniable. His confession, his obsessive behavior toward Elianne, and his violent past painted a clear picture. The prosecution presented a compelling case, one that was difficult to dispute. But it was the emotional testimony from Elianne's family and friends that seemed to sway the jury the most. They spoke of Elianne's dreams, her future, and the fact that she had been taken too soon, her life stolen in a senseless act of violence. The trial became more than just a legal proceeding. It became a chance for Elianne's loved ones to share her story with the world. They spoke of the bright young girl who had so much potential, whose life had been taken before she had the chance to fulfill her dreams. The courtroom was filled with tears as they described Elianne's love for helping others, her passion for human rights, and the impact she had made on everyone who knew her. The defense tried to argue that Paul's actions had been impulsive, but the prosecution hammered home the point that no matter how much Paul had suffered, he had made a choice. He chose to act on his rage. He chose to stalk Elianne. He chose to kill her. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated. It seemed like a simple case, too clear-cut to be anything but a conviction. When the verdict finally came, the courtroom held its breath. The judge addressed the room, reading the decision aloud. "Guilty of murder in the first degree," he said. The words hit like a punch to the gut. Nadine's face crumpled in relief and pain. It was the justice she had been waiting for, but it would never bring her daughter back. Paul Harris was led away in handcuffs, his fate sealed. But the questions didn't end with the verdict. Many still wondered, was Paul Harris the only one involved? There had been rumors of another person being involved, someone who had helped him, but there was never any concrete evidence to prove it. The police had thoroughly investigated every angle, but the answers were still elusive. Elianne's murder had been solved, but the true nature of Paul's obsession and the depths of his violence remained hidden behind his silence. The trial of Paul Harris had come to a close, and the community of Croydon was left to grapple with the aftermath. While the guilty verdict had brought a sense of closure to many, the pain of Elianne Andam's death still lingered. Her life had been tragically cut short by someone who, it seemed, could have been stopped long before that fateful morning. The trial, while delivering justice, left a bittersweet taste in the mouths of those who had known her. Nadine, Elianne's mother, sat in her living room, the weight of the verdict still heavy on her heart. She had spent the last few weeks replaying every moment she could remember about Elianne, her daughter's laughter, her ambition, her dreams. Every thought led to the same painful realization. Elianne was gone. The world would never be the same without her. Despite the conviction, Nadine couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The question of why Paul Harris had targeted her daughter and whether there was anyone else involved still haunted her. The police had found no direct evidence linking anyone else to the crime, but Nadine couldn't help but wonder if the full story had yet to be uncovered. As the weeks passed, Nadine found herself reflecting on the trial and the emotional toll it had taken on her. There had been moments of hope, moments when it felt as though Elianne's memory might live on through the justice system. But there were also moments of despair. The trial had forced her to confront the worst nightmare any parent could face: the brutal murder of their child. Her daughter had been taken from her in a senseless act of violence, and now the only thing left for Nadine was to try and make sense of it all. The pain was unimaginable, and yet she was determined to make sure that Elianne's legacy wasn't forgotten. The community had rallied around her, offering support in every way they could, but no amount of sympathy could replace what had been lost. In the wake of the trial, Croydon was never the same. The town had come together to support Elianne's family, but the fear of violence remained in the air. A young girl had been killed in broad daylight, and many were left wondering how something like this could happen in their own community. The crime had shaken the very foundation of the town, leaving residents with a lingering sense of unease. The local school that Elianne had attended held a memorial service in her honor. Her classmates, teachers, and friends gathered to remember the bright, young girl whose future had been stolen from her. The memorial was emotional, with many in attendance speaking about the profound impact Elianne had on their lives. Her teachers shared stories of her dedication to her studies and her passion for helping others. Her friends spoke of her kindness and her drive to make the world a better place. For Nadine, the memorial was bittersweet. She was grateful for the support, but the reality that her daughter was no longer there to share these moments was an unbearable burden. Her grief was overwhelming, but so was her determination to ensure that Elianne's death was not in vain. She wanted the world to know who Elianne was, not just the victim of a senseless crime, but a young woman with dreams and aspirations. As the months went by, the police closed their investigation into the murder, officially ending the case. Paul Harris was sentenced to life in prison, and the community was left to move on. But for Nadine, the journey was far from over. Every day without Elianne was a painful reminder of the emptiness she felt inside. Nadine began speaking at local schools about the dangers of violence and the importance of community support. She spoke out about her daughter's death, determined to make sure that others didn't have to experience the same heartbreak. She became an advocate for victims of violent crime, using her pain to fuel her fight for justice. The memory of Elianne and the pain of losing her never left Nadine, but she had found a new purpose in life, one that honored her daughter's memory and worked to prevent others from experiencing the same kind of tragedy. She knew that Elianne would never be forgotten. The trial was over. Paul Harris had been sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Elianne Andam. The community of Croydon had done what it could to support Elianne's family, but for Nadine, the journey was far from over. The grief of losing her daughter had never subsided, but she had found a new mission, one that kept her connected to the world that Elianne had once been a part of. Nadine's life after the trial became a blend of sorrow and resolve. Every day without Elianne was a reminder of what had been lost, but Nadine knew that in order to honor her daughter's memory, she had to keep moving forward. The pain was constant, but it no longer controlled her. Instead, it drove her to speak out, to advocate for change, and to make sure Elianne's story would never be forgotten. She began working with local organizations dedicated to raising awareness about youth violence. She spoke at schools, at community events, and even to law enforcement, sharing Elianne's story and the devastating consequences of violence. She wanted to ensure that her daughter's legacy lived on through the positive changes she could help bring to the community. Nadine's work was not without its challenges. It was emotionally exhausting to revisit the details of Elianne's death again and again, but Nadine felt a deep sense of responsibility. Her daughter had been taken too soon, but she was determined to make sure her death wasn't in vain. The more Nadine shared Elianne's story, the more she saw the impact it had on others. Parents, teachers, and young people all listened to her, and she could see the changes starting to take place. One of the most important aspects of Nadine's advocacy was ensuring that people understood the signs of violence before it was too late. She worked with schools to implement programs aimed at identifying potential threats and offering support to young people who were at risk. She knew that if more people had paid attention to the warning signs, Elianne might still be alive today. As time passed, Nadine began to find moments of peace. It was never easy, and the pain of losing Elianne never truly left her. But she had learned to live with it. She had found a sense of purpose in her grief, and in doing so, she had become a symbol of strength for others who were dealing with similar tragedies. One day, as she stood in front of a group of young students, telling them about Elianne's dreams and the tragic loss that had stolen them away, Nadine felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She could never bring Elianne back, but she had given her daughters life meaning through the work she was doing. It was a bittersweet victory, one that didn't erase the pain, but helped transform it into something positive. Elianne's legacy lived on through the work Nadine did and through the countless lives she touched. The story of a young girl with a bright future, taken too soon by an act of senseless violence, became a powerful reminder of the importance of community, compassion, and the need to protect our children. If you want to keep Elianne's memory alive and support efforts to prevent violence in our communities, don't forget to like and subscribe. Share this story so others can hear about the impact Elianne's life and tragic death have had on so many. Justice was served, but the fight for change continues. Together, we can make sure her legacy lives on.